Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Loren Richmond Jr. welcomes the Reverend Rebekah Simon-Peter to the show. Rebekah is passionate about reconnecting spiritual leaders with their God-given powers to co-create miracles with the divine. Her award-winning group coaching program, Creating a Culture of Renewal, has energized church leaders across the country to reclaim their calling and to grow their ministries. Rebekah is the author of several books, including Forging a New Path, Moving the Church Forward in a Post-Pandemic World, Dream Like Jesus, The Jew Named Jesus, Green Church Leader Guide, and 7 Simple Steps to Green Your Church. Her next book is scheduled to be published October 2024. A dynamic speaker, Rebekah has engaged and challenged audiences around the country. She is an avid hiker, dog mom, wife to Jerry, lover of coffee, and a gratitude junkie. One housekeeping detail before our conversation begins. Please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. Your engagement helps to ensure that these really important conversations about navigating and resourcing the future of the church continue and reach more people.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Loren Richmond. Today I am pleased to be joined by the Reverend Rebekah Simon-Peter. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Loren. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Glad to have this conversation. Share, if you would, anything else you'd like listeners to know about yourself and a little bit about your background and faith journey.
Oh, gosh. How much time do we have? So I was born and raised Jewish in an interfaith home, and a Jewish mom who actually just passed away. So we're observing some Jewish traditions that are really lovely around grieving and supporting one another. And then a Catholic dad. And so I grew up kind of already in an interdenominational world, except my dad was already a lapsed Catholic. So my mom and dad had decided to raise us in one faith tradition, and they decided on Catholic. But then my mom realized my dad wasn't even going to church, so they switched over to Jewish. So all of us kids were raised in the Jewish faith, except my 2 older brothers who had actually already been baptized. So I think it's so funny that I'm the one that actually had a call into the ministry and a relationship with Jesus, but I was not baptized. We were all raised Reform. I was really into it. I loved being Jewish. I loved all the traditions and everything. And then I had a big God experience, which moved me into the Orthodox Jewish world, where I was for 6 years. And then I had a Jesus experience, which moved me into being a friend and then follower of Jesus, where I've been for the last 30-odd years. So I have quite the faith journey, and my name is actually part of that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, Simon-Peter. People wonder, well, are you Simon and you married a Peter? Well, actually, when I had this big experience, a vision of Jesus, a waking vision of Jesus, very Jewish Jesus, which is the only thing that would have gotten my attention, a friend of mine said, well, Jesus was Jewish. It was like, yeah. She said, well, all the disciples were Jewish. And I was like, what's a disciple? She said, oh, you've never read the New Testament. I said, it's not my book. She said, I'm going to get you a copy. And I thought, well, I'm not going to read it. She got me a copy. I didn't read it at the time, but I did go to seminary. And while I was in seminary, I had what we call the call to ministry. And as a part of that, I did feel such a shift within me that I thought the old name doesn't even work anymore.
Interesting.
So God kind of started to whisper a new name to me. And I had to ask my friend again, hey, is there a guy in the Bible named Simon-Peter? Because I hadn't read the New Testament yet. Is there a guy named Simon-Peter? She said, yeah. I said, is he a good guy or bad guy? Because I know how the Bible goes, right? Is he a good guy or bad guy? She said, well, he's a pretty good guy. Well,
Yeah,
that was the
mostly
name,
good.
right? That was the name that God was kind of whispering to me. And so I ended up changing my whole name to be this reflection of, a Jewish person who follows Jesus. Simon was, a Jew who followed Jesus. In the process, Jesus changed his name. So I thought that's just a perfect symbol for me of the journey that I've been on. So that's where the name comes from.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that deep personal story. Thank you again for your time as you're continuing to grieve the loss of your mother. And thank you just for, what an interesting story. Appreciate you sharing that. I'm curious, as you reflect on that, how is your being raised in the Jewish faith, if I can ask this, informed your practice of Christianity today?
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, it's given me such a deep appreciation for Jesus. In many circles, because of bad history in the Christian church, and I mean centuries ago, that
Right.
history of anti-Semitism, it's just really helped me see Jesus from a new perspective and bring that new perspective to churches like, even this business of touching the hem of his garment. Most people think, oh, well, the guy wore a long thing and he had a hem and you reach out, you touch the hem. But really, when you look at it, Jesus was wearing fringes, which is traditional Jewish prayer shawl. It was more of a garment in those days. And so what she was doing is she was reaching out and touching his tzitzit. Those are the knots and the fringes that each one is representative of one of the 613 mitzvot or commandments found in the Hebrew Bible. And so when you see Jesus in this extremely Jewish perspective, I think the main thing that it does, Loren, is it places the story of the New Testament firmly back in the Jewish community. Here's a Jewish guy talking to Jewish people about Jewish ideas. And that's very different than the good Christian Jesus against the bad, faithless Jews, which is often once you take that Hebrew Bible and you put it together with a New Testament, you bind it and you stick it in a church pew, it has a whole different context than, say, the Hebrew Bible does in a synagogue. Especially without the New Testament. So really understanding the New Testament did not exist in Jesus's day. All that there was parts of what we now call the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. So when, who is it? One of the New Testament guys, sorry, I can't remember his name, says, all of this is good for instruction. He's referring to the Bible. All of this is good for instruction. He's not talking about the New Testament. He's talking about the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
So when we see it's a Jewish prophet talking to Jewish people about Jewish ideas, it just changes the whole thing. Now, it's been read, it's been interpreted, there's layers, there's glosses, there's droshes, there's revisions, there's rescissions, there's all of that happens in a text over the centuries that shift it. But I do think it makes an extremely interesting and sort of more organic kind of piece when we see it in its original context.
I can't help but think that you mentioned, like, when you went to seminary, you hadn't read the New Testament yet. It kind of brings to mind, probably folks wouldn't say, like, officially they'd never read the Old Testament.
Probably.
But there is kind of that weightedness in many traditional seminaries where, like, the only thing that really matters is the New Testament, right? And like the Old Testament, you might as well not have read it, right?
Yeah, in part because replacement theology is so prevalent. And in my book, I know we're not talking about this book, but in my book, The Jew Named Jesus, A Jew Named Jesus, I just really take on a lot of that revisionism that's been there in Christian history and try to get us back to originals, original looking at things. And my book came out right around the same time as Amy Jill Levine's. I probably shouldn't mention Amy Jill Levine in the same interview here, but I sort of think of my stuff as Amy Jill Levine light, like, for people who kind of just want to get the gist of it. She does a beautiful job of going in depth on so many levels. She makes a powerful case with a strong foundation. I look to my own experiences and my own history and my own studies and learning to write the book that I wrote, but it came out right around the same time. So it's interesting that was sort of this opening, in the Christian world to take a look at this.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure the Christian faith could use a more accessible, for as brilliant as Amy Jo Levine is. I'm not sure how much her work is always accessible, right, to the average pew sitter.
She's brilliant and fabulous. I've met her. I like her. And even I had a bit of a hard time, working through all the Hebrew that was in the book. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, speaking of books, we're here to talk somewhat about another book of Rebekah's called Forging a New Path, Moving the Church Forward in a Post-Pandemic World. So before we get too much into that, kind of what interested me when I was introduced to Rebekah was just kind of about her work in the church revitalization space. So I want to just share if you would broadly about that work and kind of what inspires you to want to help churches.
Yeah. When I went to seminary, right, way back when I went to seminary, got the call to ministry, started off in local church. I served 3 local churches. I'm in the United Methodist world. I served a beautiful primarily black church, a large sort of suburban, sort of corporate feeling church, and then a smaller rural-ish Wyoming church. So those are the 3 spaces that I served in. And in every place I served, I loved the people. They loved God. It was clear. And at the same time, I sort of felt like I was raring to go and they were sort of holding back. And I thought, is it the difference between an adult, sort of conversion experience and being raised in the faith? At the time, I thought it was. I didn't understand that later there were some simple personality differences. And so I did a lot of pushing and pulling and trying to get people to do what I thought we were supposed to be doing. And in the end, I thought, I could give 24/7. I could give myself 24/7, and that's probably what it would take to keep the growth going. Because there was definitely growth happening in all the churches I served. But I had this sneaking suspicion that if I began to withdraw any of my energy, things would sort of, slowly implode. And I hated that idea, but I didn't know how to do it differently. I just didn't, I didn't know what to do differently. So I ended up leaving local church ministry after 12 years because it's not that I didn't love God. It's not that I gave up on Jesus. It's not that I rescinded my call or anything like that. It's just that I got burnt out. I thought, my gosh, how does a person keep going, And especially when I found that I pulled some of my big books off the top shelf, and did some more in-depth kind of sermons. I got some pushback because it didn't immediately meet what people thought they already believed and should believe. There was all that sort of stuff going on. So I got into a kind of ministry that I would say is entrepreneurial ministry. In the United Methodist Church, we call it extension ministry, where you're extending the ministry of the church beyond the 4 walls. So for me, I was sort of a startup, and I was doing basically continuing education for church leaders, leadership development. And I started in the area of reading the Bible with Jewish eyes, and then I went to sort of Green Church because I'd also written books on that. That was part of my background. But I got a lot of calls for leadership development. And the first thing I thought is, what do I know about leadership development? I thought, well, I better learn because this is what is being asked for. And so slowly, I began to do the work that revealed to me the program that I now lead. I designed and developed, and it's called Creating a Culture of Renewal. So it's way beyond, sort of planting a new church or starting a new ministry or doing a fresh expression or getting small groups going, even though every single one of those things is important, or fresh worship. Right. Every single one of those things is important. But this was looking at something deeper because my background was environmental studies. I was used to thinking in terms of ecosystems and sort of how everything works together, right? Water and air and soil and inputs and outputs and all of that. All of that's part of an ecosystem. Well, there's an ecosystem in the church that has it either be more in the space of we used to call it maintenance versus mission. When I was in a local church, is a church in maintenance mode or is it in mission mode? But now I would say more, is the church in sort of stagnation or is it in renewal? Is it in decline or is it in renewal?
Mm-hmm.
And decline, I would look at numbers like around worship. I would look at vitality of prayer life. I would look at vigorousness of risk taking and dreaming. I would think about the kind of leadership that's happening. Does everybody have to agree? And does there have to be consensus and just thinking of feelings, or can there be some curious, adventuresome stuff taking place? And so I would think of churches that are in the decline mode or churches that are in the renewal mode. And when I think about renewal, I think about the renewal of miracles. Because when you think about it, what set Jesus apart from every other teacher of his day? And there were many. There were even other teachers that had disciples. There were traveling teachers. There were many, many interesting characters on the scene at Jesus's time. What set Jesus apart? He did miracles. Now, he actually wasn't the only miracle maker out there. Okay, there was Honi, the circle maker, and there were, in the Talmudic literature, you can see there were some other miracle makers. But really, the big person that we remember from those days is Jesus. Why?
Right.
Miracles. Jesus was all about the miracle. And many of our churches are so far removed from miracles, they wouldn't know one if it knocked on the door. And they're sort of, busy trying to do their own thing. And they operate, Loren, in sort of this middle band of predictability and reliability. Yeah. And I mean, I get it, especially for organizations that are worried about, sort of going out of business. I get it. Mm-hmm. But it does take us very far from the space that Jesus operated in, which was the miraculous, the unpredictable, the risk-taking, the pivot, the about-face, like the stuff you just don't expect. The Bible happens to be full of that, The meta message is, hey, what you think is the right thing, or what you think God's going to do, he's probably going to do something else. That's kind of the meta story of the Bible. I think Jesus is a perfect, living exemplar for us of that. And so what I really am interested in is helping churches get back into the zone of the miraculous, where they're co-creating miracles with God. And a lot of times that means moving from sort of being content with having members and doing stuff like that, and even from contentment to sort of making disciples, to actually advancing to apostleship, advancing from discipleship to apostleship. Because if you think about it, discipleship has us constantly follow. Mm-hmm. And Jesus even said, look, I'm calling you people because I'm going to send you out. He trained them how to do all this stuff. He sent them out to do that stuff. There would be no even memory of Jesus or of the church if it weren't for those people he called to him that ended up being apostles. So I think we're actually called to something even greater than attending or being members, but being advocates, ambassadors, authorized, anointed apostles. I know it's so traditional language, and different denominations will hear that differently.
Right.
I mean it in the broadest, most generous way possible when I say apostleship.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate just that framework, that frame of mind of believing, so a miracle can happen. And let's be frank, right? Like, many churches need a miracle.
They do. Yes.
Something we can agree on.
Yeah.
So obviously a lot has happened in the American Christian cultural space since 2020. And you're welcome to answer this kind of as much as you're willing to reveal. Like, I'm just curious, like, how are you as a clergy leader? How are the pastors in the churches you talk to? In your book, you write about the so much unprocessed grief. What have you seen that, as you encounter with your work with various churches and pastors?
Yeah. Well, first, from a personal standpoint, I, as much as anybody, wanted things to go back to normal.
Mm-hmm.
As much as anybody else didn't want this pandemic to have broad-reaching implications. I remember early in the days, maybe April 2020, there were already big magazine spreads. I thought, how do they know? But, we're never going back. I thought, we're like a month in, or 2 months, or 3 or 6. How do they know? And it scared me. I'll just tell you the flat out truth. It scared me. Oh my God. Because at that time, we were in the sort of shutdowns, and I had a fear that, are we ever going to leave? I mean, I just couldn't even see past where we were. I had never been through a pandemic or an epidemic, not personally. I just didn't know what it was going to be like. And I knew that the pastors around me were scared. I also knew that they were really rising to the occasion.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that was extraordinary was how quickly, like I and many others for years, Loren, have been pushing, for churches to make some leaps. Online giving and,
Right.
don't just equate yourself with the building and be willing to pivot, and all of a sudden overnight, this thing called COVID-19, did it. So tremendous respect for the pastors that were on the front lines in churches that had overnight to figure out how to go online and figure stuff out. So I think in some ways there was unprocessed grief. Who had time? Who had time to grieve? They just had to spring into action. And so tremendous admiration for the pastors doing that. I do think there was a certain amount of weariness that came after that. Just deep weariness. People were overextended. It sort of looked like they were doing nothing, just showing up on a little camera on Sunday morning. But of course, these are the same people who often hear you just work 1 hour a week, which we all know isn't true. So I think that's part of the reason there was unprocessed grief. I think what I'm seeing now as I continue to work in this space through creating a culture of renewal and other work that I do with other denominations and leaders, laity and clergy, is that, we're coming back. Churches are coming back. There was definitely a dip. There was a dip in attendance. Surprisingly, not always a dip in giving. I think giving stayed pretty steady. Did you?
Yeah, the data has shown that.
Yeah, giving stayed pretty steady, but attendance declined. Missional engagement declined. Connectivity, there was online connectivity, but I mean like this togetherness. Like all of a sudden, it's perfectly okay to just show up on Zoom. All kinds of fabulous uses of that. But we have lost something of, this togetherness where you can touching shoulders, touching the hem of a garment. I mean, imagine that online, So there's a lot that's been lost. There's a lot that's been gained. And I'm sensing in the United Methodist and in other parts of the mainline world that there's now this readiness to get going again. Okay, let's have a vision. We're ready to take the next step.
I hope you're right. Boy, oh boy, I hope you're right.
What are you seeing, Loren? What are you seeing?
Well, this is a podcast where I like to hear from others. So I still have so many more questions to ask you we got to get to, so I don't want to delay those, but I am appreciative of your insights and your hopefulness. It's said that COVID accelerated many changes that were coming to church in America. Certainly you mentioned like some examples like the move to utilize online giving, trying to get people out of the building and be more of a, the phrase we all heard a million times, church is not the building. Certainly utilizing more this kind of thing, telecommunications tools for meetings. Not always does every meeting have to take place around a table at the church. What are some other examples that you've seen of accelerated change coming to churches?
Yeah. Well, Loren, I think one of the toughest things that COVID brought to us, accelerated in change, was the decline in worship. And it was already happening. In my book, Forging a New Path, I write about the 3 questions people are asking. When do things go back to normal? How do we get people to church or back to church? And how do we do more with less? And the truth is, 2019, we were already wondering those same things. How do we, when do we get back to the way it used to be? How do we get people back to church, and how do we do more with less? We were already asking those questions. We were asking those questions in 2015 and 2020 and in 2000. Okay, there was a little bump after 2001.
Right.
That went away. And then we were wondering, how do we get back? How do we get back? Sort of always remembering the good old days. And so I think it did accelerate people's departure from the church and their evaluation. Is this really serving me? Does this have what I need? And honestly, I think, and I write about this in the book, Loren, about the spiritual but not religious. And, the big exodus from the church, if you read the Pew Studies or any of those other folks that are tracking religious life in America and beyond, the spiritual but not religious are a big component.
Yeah.
And the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S,
Right.
but the nuns and the duns, that's just a big part. People have been leaving church because there's something missing from church, or they're just not finding what they're looking for there. And I think that kind of sped it up.
Yeah. Well, let's come back to that spiritual growth component. You used the phrase and talked about this obviously in the book, the question of how to do more with less. From my perceptions of really where the American church, and I hate to use this word, industry is going, it seems like the middle-sized church is really going to struggle the most because when we think about a mega church or really big church just really has, again, to use an economic term, economies of scale to make things, they're often run kind of like the word you use, like a mini corporation often. And then in the contrast, a really small, really tiny church can often be sustained by a couple, 3 families who are just really committed to it.
Yeah.
Whereas what used to be kind of the classic 150 size church, to me at least, seems to be like the most vulnerable because of declines in giving, declines in participation, and then just not having, if they're trying to compete with the behemoth churches, they just don't have the resources to compete with a big musical production or children's programming or what name you. So many churches are facing this real how to do more with less challenge. What have you offered churches of that medium variety?
Yeah, the medium range. Yeah, the medium. This is true in women's clothing too. Those sizes, they're not really, you can't really count on the sizes you grew up with because now, anyway, that's a whole other story. But it used to be that the medium-sized church was what? 350, maybe even close to 500, like 100 to 500. And then, below that was small.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now those churches are shrinking, and you're right. They're shrinking down into that category that we think of as small churches. And you're right. A couple of families, several committees or interest groups, can really sustain a church like that. I've really chosen to think about, what we can learn from the spiritual but not religious. Because after all, they are the people that were in the churches that left. So it's almost like we never did the exit interview.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what was really missing for people? And I write in the book, there are a lot of people who say, gosh, I don't know what I would do without church. And sometimes it's meant to be a dig at the people who've left church. How do they get by without a church? Well, many ways they're getting by just fine because they found other forms of community.
Right.
But what can we learn from the spiritual but not religious? I think there's so much we can learn, which is primarily we can bring more spirituality into our churches.
Mm-hmm.
I'm all for religion. I'm all for that binding together of community. But what if that was simply the way we gather, some of the traditions, like right now, my family, is honoring Jewish mourning traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's bringing our family together in some amazing ways. Do we all believe the same? Nope. Do we all even believe in God? No. Do we all have spirituality? No, but we've got this religion and these practices that are actually holding us together long enough that I can see it happening in my family members. There's some spirituality happening. There's some God awakening moments that are happening. So let's have religion be what religion is, this powerful, beautiful container for us. Let's not give up our traditions. We can tweak, of course, but let's have the traditions we have. Now, within those traditions, what is it we're actually lifting up and surfacing? Well, what about spirituality? What about that? I'm not saying we give up mission. I'm not saying we give up helping people, but why not fill people? Why not give people the opportunity to deeply connect with a power greater than themselves?
Yeah.
Why not give people the chance to have that one-on-one? The Bible is a record of people's spiritual encounters with God and then what happened as a result. But we now read the Bible as a series of morality tales. Do, don't, extra, extra,
Right,
do,
right.
extra, extra, don't, right?
Yep.
That's how we read it. But what if we peeled away that layer and got back into, oh, here's a series of encounters with God, and here's how people responded and grew spiritually and what they did. So I'm all about helping people really deepen the spiritual power of their churches. And that's individual spirituality, that's communal spirituality, and then there's visionary spirituality. So this is the good stuff I came up with after I wrote the book. But, individual spirituality, like, I matter, and each of us can have that deep connection. Communal spirituality, where the church itself is a spiritual community and we grow spiritually. We're safe to talk about our spirituality. We're safe to grow in it together. And then visionary spirituality is where, we take this beautiful spiritual connection we have and we envision how can we bless the world with it.
Yes.
Not so much from we have, you don't, we're going to save you. A lot of times that's where mission comes from, but from this deep spirituality that inhabits all of us, what can we share? How can we let our spirituality expand beyond us?
Yes. What I really appreciate that is, and I'm convinced that, and this is, I'm in debt to the work of theologian Andrew Root on this, but I'm convinced that really what's lacking in so many churches is, like you said, a spirituality, this idea that, like, we come here to find God, because this is my opinion, and you can push back or disagree if you think so, but I think we can find community in so many other spaces. We can find connection, we can find friendships, we can frankly find social justice movements in other spaces. I'm of the opinion, at least, that I come to church because, especially in our modern world where it can be so hard to find and recognize God's presence, to me, at least, church is a place where I know it can go, hear the testimony, like you said, of other people connecting with God, be in a place where I know people have connected with God, and be around people who may be experiencing God presence in the moment, right?
Yeah. I totally agree with you, Loren. No pushback here.
And that's why I really appreciate your emphasis on spirituality. So you talk about in your book this idea of helping people grow in their stages of faith. And I think as someone who's been really interested in that and studied, or at least unofficially studied, church culture, I suppose, from evangelical to mainline spaces. If we're going to broadly use James Fowler's, at least I'm assuming that's kind of what you're working on, his stages of faith, we would broadly say that, like, many evangelical churches are in a stage 2, many mainliners churches are probably in a stage 3. And it's, from my opinion, really hard to create a space where you can have those 4 and 5s feel, I don't know, appreciated or welcome, but also, like, feeding that need of that 2. So talk more about that, because that's a broad range of spirituality.
Yeah. So James Fowler, is who we're talking about. He's got, 5 stages. The first stage is fantasy and reality. That's sort of preschoolers. Second stage is school-age children beginning to understand logic, but they're still thinking about things very literally. Jonah, belly of the whale, right?
Yeah.
And then the third stage, synthetic, conventional, teenage years. This is where people begin to develop, their all-encompassing belief systems. And they synthesize what they know from school and their friends and their family and, work if they're working. And they're starting to unconsciously form their belief systems. And they're unaware that they actually have a system and that other people have other systems or other experiences. And their belief system provides a sense of stability and identity and belonging. And it's important. And trust is placed in individuals or groups that best represent their belief system. And a lot of people stay in that stage, like you said, throughout their lives. Well, Fowler's fourth stage, he calls that individuative or reflective. And that can begin to unfold as early as young adulthood. But what happens here is awareness starts to expand, And the realization begins to dawn on a person, hey, the way I look at things is sort of one way among many. And so there sort of starts to be critical exploration of their own system, sometimes disillusionment with their beliefs.
Probably the
And they
deconstruction that's so popular, right?
Deconstruction, yeah. They become disenchanted. They swing to the opposite side. I think that's what happened for my dad, actually.
Yeah.
Because, he was raised in, this third stage kind of thing. And he began to think, well, Jesus isn't thinking about every one of my thoughts. And how could God and blah, blah, blah. And he swung the other side. Now, my dad and I have had a number of conversations, and he's actually identified as spiritual. And it's like, whoa, what a big thing for my dad. He's 88. Okay. So spiritual, but not religious is sort of when he remembers that's how he identifies. And, so what happens is stage 3 people think that stage 4 people have become backsliders when actually they're really moving forward. And then the 5th stage, just to give an overview for Fowler, it's called the conjunctive faith. It's sort of midlife. And the limits of logic are acknowledged, the paradoxes of life are accepted and integrated. And at this point, a person could actually return to the stories of their faith, not have to take them literally, hold science and scripture and spirituality all together, and sort of, what we call live in the mystery of it all. Like relate to the parts they relate to, don't get hung up on the parts they don't get hung up on, and they don't have to be an either or. Now, stage 6, that's sort of Dalai Lama, Jesus,
right.
Mother Teresa, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalom. There are people, right? And you've heard it said that the people sort of at the pinnacle, they all relate to each other, regardless of the faith tradition they've come out of, much more to each other than any of the rest of us plebeians, right? So how could a church actually, hold space at least from 3 to 4 into 5? If we produce a 6, fabulous, right? But, 3 into 4, 5, I think it's if we adopt the metaphor or the symbol or the concept or the vehicle of spiritual journey. That we're all on a spiritual journey. And we don't berate where somebody is on the journey. If you've ever been a pastor, or any kind of leader, that one of the best ways to approach people is not to insist on your way, because, that's not going to work for everybody, but meet people where they're at, wherever they are. Can they move one step forward in their journey, given their beliefs? Can they move a step or 2 or 3 forward, on their path? That's how I tried to approach it with people when it came to faith. What would it take for them to move forward in their journey? And so I think when we really adopt that whole idea of we're all on a spiritual journey, that we can then begin to make space for people who are in different parts of the journey. And there's plenty of examples in the Bible, literally spiritual journeys. And then, plenty of stories of Jesus's people, Jesus and the people their stories with him. But in the Hebrew Bible, there's stories too. I just think the Bible's full of those stories of people on a journey, meet God, the journey changes somehow, they deepen with God, something happens. I mean, that's the whole Bible. So I think we could take that, I don't think it's a hard stretch to take that, and that would create more of a space for people to move in their direction within one congregation.
Yeah, that's helpful. I appreciate you sharing that. I was kind of chuckling internally too as you were describing those stages of faith, because I was thinking about our previous, well, actually not as I'm recording this, the last episode that released was the 2-part episode with Dr. Elizabeth Schrader Pulzer, who's the New Testament scholar of Mary Magdalene. And it's very much kind of the process she described of her own kind of journey of like growing up in church, kind of disappearing in her 20s. And then like now she's a New Testament professor. So it is so essential that churches can somehow make space for people when they're going through that 3, 4, whatever stage.
Yeah.
It's such hard work, but important work, right?
Yeah. I think we're pretty good at doing 1, 2, and 3 because, we have preschool, we have Sunday school, we can get people to 3. I think we just haven't thought too much about how do you help people navigate 4 and get to 5. But I bet a lot of pastors are in 5. where they've done the wrestling and they're
Yeah.
sort of in this place of science and scripture, faith and tradition and science and life and, you know what I mean? Like sort of holding it all. We kind of have to.
This is my hobby horse, Rebekah, so forgive me, but I'm like, it feels like in evangelical churches, it's like they bang on the force for being like you said, backslidden, and then what I think happens in mainline and progressive circles, it's just like, oh, well, yeah, you're fine. Like, that's fine. You can stay at 4. So that's why I appreciate you're like, hey, you're not done yet.
Yes, you're not done yet.
Yeah. Spiritual journey. All right.
Yeah.
Let's do one more question here before we take a break, because I think this is important. You brought it up earlier, and I don't want to let it go. You mentioned in your book making disciples of Jesus versus creating church attenders. And I was just listening to, of all things, a Southern Baptist podcast this morning when I was walking the dog, and they're talking about, 30, 40 years ago, the culture was you could just open up a church, people would show up, and you'd have a bunch of church attenders. Even in mainline contexts, there was a similar reality.
Yeah.
Talk about how to make disciples rather than church attenders.
Yeah. First off, it'd be fabulous to have church attenders, right? Like, let's not cast aspersions on the church attenders.
Yes, please.
Let's not assume that just coming to church is enough, even for the person who's coming.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we don't have to have some agenda, like a hidden agenda, but I think people who come to church are looking to grow.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not necessarily looking to just hop on a committee. I've made that mistake.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you're new? Would you like to serve on this committee, that committee?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, you're never coming back? Oh, sorry. I've made that mistake. So, but I think when we can journey with people and really get to know what their life is about, what are their hopes, their hurts, what brought them to church, what are they looking for, that we can find the answers, or we can guide them and direct them deeper into the life of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, the presence of Jesus. And so I think we need to not assume biblical literacy is one thing. And a lot of discipleship now is just really about deeply acquainting people with the life of Jesus and what did he teach? And what are the ways to understand that? What are the ways to follow in his footsteps? And that moves somebody from simply attending to moving into that space of discipleship. Jesus is my teacher. Let me be his student. And then as I hinted at before, Loren, I think that to truly follow Jesus and to emulate him then is to understand that Jesus is interested in sending people out who have agency, who have freely accepted the authority that he grants and the miracle making that he offers, and that we become partners with him in being active agents of good stuff in the world, and that we can be part of the solution in so many ways. And I'm not even presuming that I know what the solution is, if only we had more of this or more of that.
Right.
But what if it was just about love and acceptance? What if it was even as simple as that? So I do think there's people who come, wonderful. We, come, please join us in church. Then getting deeper into the teachings, understanding the teachings and the ethos and Jesus's way of being. And then don't forget that part where Jesus then took those people and authorized and taught them to go out. And so part of that going out was deepening their spirituality, not only having the faith of a disciple, but beginning to have the faith of an apostle. And what does that actually mean? And that's actually my next book that's coming out.
All right.
It's going to be about that. So anyway.
Well, plenty to tease there. We've only dived into just a little bit about Rebekah's work. Again, this book we've been hinting around is Forging a New Path, Moving the Church Forward in a Post-Pandemic World. She's obviously got other books she's written, one coming here in the pipeline. We'll make sure we have links to all that in the show notes. But for right now, let's take a quick break and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Reverend Rebekah Simon-Peter and enjoyed the conversation. So closing questions, you're welcome to take these as seriously or not as you'd like to. First question, if you're Pope for a day, what might that day look like for you?
Oh, my goodness. It would mean the first female Jewish Christian, woo, became Pope. If I were Pope for a day, that's like if I were Queen for a day.
Yes.
Oh. Let's circle back around. I feel like this is sort of one of those shows where I don't have the answer right away.
Sure. Yeah, that's fine. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
You know, I always think about Martin Luther King Jr. and what a firebrand that guy was and what it would be like to be in his presence for a bit. But I also think about some of the earlier mystics like Teresa of Avila. Oh, just to hang out with her. What would that have been like? Catherine Kuhlman, a Pentecostal female pastor from about, 80 years ago, who performed miracles. She was a Pentecostal. I studied her a little bit when I was early in my Christian journey. I'd love to know more about her. You know, what was actually going on for her? How'd she do that stuff? So those are some of the people I'm interested in.
Yeah, related. I've been reading, it seems like Amy Simple McPherson keeps coming up, and wow, what a figure she was. Holy smokes.
Yeah, she was another person I studied. So interesting.
Yeah. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
Politics.
Yes.
The politics. I think in many ways, churches will be seen as a corollary or subsidiary of the political scene, not as the leading light. Doesn't mean we're not doing very good work. I'm just saying there are very big issues at play here. And how will we participate?
Well, we need another podcast for that.
Yeah.
What do you hope for the future of Christianity? Maybe we could bring the element more local. What do you hope for American churches or the churches maybe you work with or will work with?
Don't give up hope. Don't give up hope. There's so much hope, and we really can dream big. There's no cap on dreaming big. We can co-create miracles. God is alive. There's no end date on the church. Your faith doesn't have to shrink because somebody thinks they don't care about church. Don't give up. Don't give up. Don't give up. And,
I think we can go back to that.
Yeah.
Let's believe in miracles, right?
Yes, absolutely. The age of miracles is not past.
Yeah. Well, where can people connect with you, learn more about the organization, all that stuff?
Oh, yeah. Thank you for asking. I can be found online at RebekahSimonPeter.com, RebekahSimonPeter.com. And you can find my website there. You can find my books on Amazon. And, just love to hear from people. And you can email me through there. And maybe there'll be connections on your podcast as well.
Yes. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. Really appreciate your time. Praying especially for God's peace with you and your family as you continue to process and grieve the loss of your mother. So may God's peace be with you.
Thank you, Loren. Such a pleasure to be with you. And thank you so much for the invitation and opportunity.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Loren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.